The television had barely finished rolling credits when the phone calls started. It was 2011. The TVNZ dramatized film Billy had just aired. And across New Zealand, people who had known the real man were already reaching for their phones. Peter Rowley, who had managed Billy T. James through the peak years, was one of the first to speak publicly. "That's not how it was," he said. "That's not who he was." Billy's daughter said something similar, not to the cameras immediately, but to the people close to her, and later, more publicly. The industry that had spent decades profiting from Billy T. James's face, his voice, his timing, his extraordinary gift for making people laugh until they hurt, had now, in his absence, decided it also owned the right to shape how he would be remembered. This video is not about finding a villain. The villain in this story is not one person. It's a machine. The biopic machine. The ratings machine. The machine of simplified tragedy that takes a complicated human being and irons out everything inconvenient until what's left fits neatly into 90 minutes of television drama. Billy T. James was too large, too contradictory, too alive to fit in 90 minutes. And the people who knew him knew that immediately. 5 people saw what the film got wrong. 5 people who had been close to his story, who knew the real rhythms of his life. They stayed mostly quiet for years. Some of them still are. But the question they asked then, and ask still, is the same question. When a man can no longer speak for himself, who gets to speak for him? And does the industry that made money from his image get to be the one who answers that? For Billy T. James, for those who carry the real memory of him, and for the question that still has no clean answer. Always. But to understand why that question matters so much, we need to go back to the beginning. To understand who Billy T. James actually was. Not the television version, the real one. William James Te Wehi Taitoko was born on the 7th of June 1948 in Palmerston North, New Zealand, Maori heritage on his father's side. A childhood that was, by most accounts, warm in some ways and difficult in others. He was funny from the start, the kind of funny that gets a child noticed, the kind of funny that becomes a social skill, a defense, a way of being in the world before it ever becomes a career. He started performing in clubs and cabarets in the 1970s, a circuit that demanded you be quick, adaptable, able to read a room and pivot in seconds. Billy could do all of that. But he could do something else too, something rarer. He could make you laugh while simultaneously making you feel something else, something underneath the laughter. A tenderness, an awareness of pain, a love for the people he was performing both with and about. His Maori characters were not mockery, they were recognition. They were a generation of New Zealanders seeing themselves on screen, hearing their cadences and rhythms and ways of speaking reflected back at them with warmth and precision. That is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, to satirize a community from within it, to use comedy as a form of love rather than a weapon. Billy did it better than almost anyone in the country's history. By the 1980s, he was a phenomenon. Television appearances, sold-out tours, his face on billboards, his catchphrases in the mouths of an entire generation. And then the heart trouble began. He had his first serious cardiac episode in the mid-1980s. Surgery followed. Recovery. Return to performing. More health scares. In 1990, he received a heart transplant. He was 42 years old. He had survived something that would have killed most people. He came back, performed again, made people laugh again. And then, on the 7th of August, 1991, the day after his 43rd birthday, his new heart failed. He was gone. And the question of who he was and how he should be remembered became immediately, urgently, contested. 5 people who had been close to him during the peak years were about to begin the longest vigil of their lives, watching what would happen to his memory, watching who would claim the right to tell his story, and watching, eventually, a television film take that story and reshape it. Always. The 5 people. Let's talk about the 5 people. They were not all friends with each other. They did not all see Billy the same way. They did not all agree on what should have been said about him, or when, or how. But they all knew the real story, the one that didn't make it into 90 minutes of prime-time television. The first was Peter Rowley, his manager during the key years, the person who had negotiated the deals, managed the chaos, watched from close range as Billy navigated fame and illness, and the particular pressures that come from being a public figure in a small country where everyone already feels they know you. Peter had watched the industry work. He understood, better than almost anyone, how it processed talent, what it took from people, and what it gave back. "I knew what would happen eventually," he would say years later. "With television, with biopics, I knew how these things go. They simplify, they dramatize, they pick the version of the story that works best as television. And I knew that wouldn't be Billy." The second was Tina, Billy's daughter. She had been young when her father died. She had grown up with the public version of him always present, always slightly different from the private one she carried. There is a particular difficulty in being the child of a public figure. The world has a version of your parent that you did not know, a version that was performed, that was shaped for an audience. And when that performance is all that survives in the cultural memory, the private truth gets quietly buried under it. Tina knew who her father was. Not the television character, not the catchphrase. The person. And when the film aired, she saw a version that didn't match either. The third was Dave, a fellow comedian who had come up through the same circuit as Billy, who had shared stages with him, watched him work from the wings, understood in the way that only another performer can understand what it cost to do what Billy did every night. "People think comedy is easy," Dave said. "They see someone making them laugh and they think, that's effortless, natural. But it's not. It's work. It's craft. And for Billy, given everything he was carrying, given the health stuff, given the pressure of being what he was to New Zealand audiences, it was enormous work. The film didn't show that work. It showed a version of him that was easy to feel sorry for. And Billy was not easy to feel sorry for. That wasn't who he was. The fourth was Margaret, who had worked as a production assistant on several of his television specials in the 1980s. She had been present at rehearsals, at recordings, at the particular unglamorous machinery of making a comedy show work. She had seen how he prepared, how seriously he took his craft beneath the apparent looseness and spontaneity of the performance. "He was meticulous," she said. "People didn't see that. They thought it all just happened, but he would work on something for days to make it look like he'd thought of it in the moment." The film showed him as this kind of naturally brilliant, slightly tragic figure, and he was brilliant. But the tragedy wasn't the point of him. The craft was the point of him. The fifth was Robert, a journalist who had interviewed Billy multiple times across the span of his career, who had written some of the few extended pieces that attempted to go beyond the public image. Robert had notes. He had recordings. He had the particular advantage of someone who had asked the hard questions while Billy was still alive to answer them. "There's a way of talking about dead people," Robert said. "Particularly dead people who were loved. You smooth things out. You make them simpler. You make them easier to grieve." The film did all of that, and it made Billy into someone that he specifically, deliberately, explicitly was not. He was complicated. He was contradictory. He was funny and difficult and generous and demanding and all the things that real human beings are. The film made him sad, and he wasn't sad. He was alive, right up until he wasn't. 5 people, 5 perspectives. 5 people who watched the 2011 film and felt something slip away. Not just accuracy, something more fundamental. The sense that Billy T. James, as a real person rather than a cultural symbol, was slowly being replaced by a television drama's version of him. And that once a television drama does that to someone, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to get the real person back. Always. The 2011 film arrived into a specific cultural moment, and to understand why it landed the way it did, you need to understand that moment. It had been 20 years since Billy died. A generation had grown up knowing him only through reruns, through family stories, through the cultural shorthand of his catchphrases. For that generation, Billy T. James was not a complicated person they had watched evolve across a career. He was a fixed image, a beloved artifact of New Zealand culture. A biopic offers that generation something they never had: the illusion of intimacy. The sense that they can now know the real story, the behind-the-scenes truth, the private man behind the public performance. The problem is that biopics are not journalism. They are not biography. They are drama. And drama has different requirements from truth. Drama requires conflict to be clear. It requires motivation to be legible. It requires that the audience understand, at every moment, who they are supposed to be feeling what about. Real lives are not like that. Real lives are full of moments where you can't tell if someone's behavior was caused by pain, or selfishness, or fear, or love, or some combination of all of them that even the person involved couldn't have articulated. Real lives are full of relationships where both people were right and both people were wrong, and the wrongness and rightness shifted constantly depending on the day and the pressure and the mood. You can't dramatize that easily, so biopics don't. They pick a version, the version that works as a story. And for Billy T. James, the version that worked as a television story in 2011 was troubled genius, underappreciated by the system that used him, ultimately destroyed by the combination of his health struggles and the pressures of fame. That is a story. It's even, in some ways, a story with elements of truth in it, but it was not the whole story. Peter Rowley was specific about what bothered him most. The relationship stuff, he said. The way the film handled his personal relationships, the way it used the women in his life, that's what I couldn't accept. Billy was complicated in that area, like a lot of people, like a lot of performers who spend their life in the spotlight and find it difficult to be present in the quieter spaces. But the film made choices about who was at fault, about who was the victim, and those choices weren't fair. And the people who were still alive, who were being characterized in those ways, they had to just absorb it, because the film was out there. TVNZ had made it. And what are you going to do? This is the specific cruelty of the biopic as a form. It doesn't just reshape the memory of the dead. It reshapes the narrative around the living, too. It assigns roles: villain, victim, supporting character, comic relief. And the living have to carry those assigned roles. They can protest. They can give interviews. They can say, "That's not how it was." But the film is in the culture now. The film has been seen by 1 million people. The interview correcting it will be seen by 10,000. The asymmetry is brutal. Dave understood this from a performer's perspective. Comedy people talk about this, he said. The way that once something becomes the official version, it's almost impossible to dislodge. A joke, a character, a story, once it gets established as the thing, the real thing, you can't really compete with it. The original is always more vivid than the correction. And a television film is very vivid, and a correction is very not vivid. So I understood, watching Billy, that this was now going to be a significant part of how he was remembered, by people who hadn't been there, who didn't know. And there's a grief in that, a particular kind of grief. Margaret, the production assistant, spoke to something more specific: the craft.
"He worked so hard," she said. "That's what gets me. When people talk about Billy as this natural talent who just had a gift and it came easily, I want to shake them."
I watched him prepare for shows. I saw the notebooks, the lists of things he wanted to try, the notes on what had worked the week before and what hadn't.
He was a craftsman. He took his work seriously in a way that doesn't fit the image of the spontaneous, naturally funny guy.
The film didn't show that because it's not dramatic. A man sitting in a room making notes isn't dramatic. A man on stage getting laughs is dramatic. So that's what you get.
But you lose something essential when you lose the craft. You lose the truth of what made him exceptional.
Robert, the journalist, put it in the broader context of how New Zealand culture treats its own. "We have this particular way of dealing with our public figures," he said. "We like them to be humble. We like them to be one of us. And when they get too big, when they start to feel like they might be bigger than the country, we get uncomfortable. And then when they die, we do the other thing. We canonize them. We make them into national treasures. But both of those things require simplification. The cutting down to size and the canonization both require you to take away the complexity." And what Billy T. James actually was, the real version, was deeply complex, in ways that made him extraordinary, but also in ways that were uncomfortable. The film chose comfortable. Tina's perspective was the one that resonated most publicly, and the most painfully. She was careful about what she said and when she said it. She knew that anything she said publicly would be seen through the lens of a bereaved daughter, which was both accurate and limiting. "People want you to be sad," she said. "When you're the child of someone who died, people have already written your role. You're the one who grieves, and everything you say gets filtered through that." What I wanted to say was, I knew him. Not the public version, not the television version. I knew him. And the television version missed things. Not everything, but things that mattered. And I didn't want my children to grow up thinking that television version was accurate. That was really it. That was the thing that bothered me most. Because they never got to know him. And if the television version is all they have, then they have something that isn't quite right. This is perhaps the most precise articulation of what is at stake when a biopic takes liberties with a real life. The grandchildren of Billy T. James will watch that film. They will form an image of who their grandfather was, and that image will have been shaped not by the people who knew him, not by the man himself, but by the requirements of a 90-minute television drama made 20 years after his death. That's not one person's fault. It's nobody's fault, in the sense that there was no malice involved. Everyone involved in making the film almost certainly believed they were honoring his memory. But the road to a simplified legacy is paved with good intentions and drama notes. Always. Let's talk about the machine itself, because understanding the biopic machine is essential to understanding what happened to Billy T. James's memory. The television biopic as a format has its own particular logic, its own set of pressures that have nothing to do with truth and everything to do with broadcast conditions. You need a protagonist who is clearly sympathetic. You need an antagonist force, which can be a person, a system, an addiction, an illness, or a combination. You need a narrative arc that moves from something recognizable, ordinary life, or at least the recognizable version of fame, towards something tragic. And you need the tragedy to feel earned, inevitable, the product of identifiable causes. Real lives almost never fit this shape. Real lives are jagged and circular and full of contradictions that resist narrative. So the biopic machine does what it has to do. It smooths the jagged edges. It cuts the circular parts. It clarifies the contradictions into something that looks like character. And in doing so, It takes a person and replaces them with a story. Robert, who had spent his career writing about real people for a living, was blunt about this. There's a fundamental dishonesty in the biopic form, he said. Not because the people making them are dishonest, but because the form itself requires you to claim you're telling the truth about someone while making choices that are fundamentally aesthetic rather than factual. When you cast an actor to play a real person, you've already lost the truth of that person. The actor is not that person. The actor's interpretation of how that person moved and spoke and held themselves is not how they moved and spoke and held themselves. Every choice in a biopic is a fiction dressed as a fact, and we all agree to accept that because the fiction is more vivid than the facts we have available. But for the people who knew the real person, who have access to the actual facts, the fiction is not acceptable. It's an insult dressed as a tribute. Peter Rowley came at it from the commercial angle. "The thing that gets me is the money," he said. "The film made money. TVNZ got ratings. The production company got paid. The actor playing Billy got a career boost. And the family got… what? The family got a version of their person that they didn't ask for and couldn't control." There's something deeply wrong with that equation. Billy's image had commercial value, his story had commercial value, and the people who had the most legitimate claim on that value, his family, were the ones with the least power to shape how it was used. This is a structural problem that extends far beyond any one television film about any one New Zealand comedian. It is the problem of intellectual property law as it applies to image and narrative. It is the problem of the gap between what a living person can protect and what the law allows once they're gone. While Billy was alive, he had legal and practical control over how his image was used. He could say yes or no to projects. He could give interviews that corrected misrepresentations. He could use his presence to complicate the simplified version. Once he died, that control passed to his estate. But the estate's legal rights are narrower than most people assume, particularly in New Zealand's legal context, and particularly with regard to biographical treatment in a dramatic form. A fiction that claims to be based on a true story occupies a gray area that is extraordinarily difficult to challenge legally. The film can get things factually wrong, and as long as it includes the right disclaimers, as long as it frames itself correctly as a dramatization rather than a documentary, the legal exposure is limited. Dave understood this frustration viscerally. "I'd be angrier if I thought being angry would help," he said. "But it doesn't. The film is out there. You can't unsee it. You can't take it back. What you can do is talk. Tell the other version. Make sure people know the fuller story exists. But you're always chasing the thing that got there first. And the thing that got there first was very well produced and very widely watched and very emotionally effective. Even if the emotion it was working with wasn't quite the real one." Margaret identified something about the timing that felt deliberate, even if it wasn't. 20 years, she said. They waited 20 years. Not explicitly, not as a stated strategy, but the pattern in biopics is almost always that they come when enough time has passed that the people closest to the subject are slightly less powerful in the culture. The witnesses are older. Some have died. The contemporaries who could push back are less visible. The journalists who covered the original story have moved on. And the new generation, the potential audience, doesn't have strong enough attachment to the real person to resist the dramatized version. 20 years is long enough for all of that to be true, and short enough that the subject still has cultural currency, still has enough nostalgic value to attract an audience. It's not a conspiracy. It's just timing that happens to work in favor of the people making the film and against the people who care about accuracy. Tina addressed something that had never been asked of her directly, but that sat beneath every conversation about the film. "Did they ask us?" she said. "Did anyone involved in making it come to us, properly come to us and say, 'We're making this. Here's what we're planning. What should we get right? What matters most to you?' And the answer is, not really. not in any way that felt meaningful. They did their research, they talked to people, but the questions they were asking were about filling in dramatic details, about finding scenes that would work on television. They weren't asking, who was he really? What do you want people to understand about him that they might not get from the public image? That question was never asked, and if it had been, the film would have been different. This is perhaps the most damning critique. Not that the film was malicious, but that the most important questions were never asked because they would have complicated the story the film needed to tell. The biopic machine runs on the assumption that it already knows what the story is. The research is not about discovering the truth. It's about populating a pre-existing narrative framework with convincing detail. And when you assume you already know the story, you stop listening to the people who could tell you something different. Always. There is something specific about Billy T. James that made the 2011 film's choices particularly pointed, something that goes beyond the generic problem of the biopic machine and into the specific cultural meaning of who he was and what he represented. Billy T. James was one of the first Maori performers to achieve mainstream New Zealand celebrity on his own terms. That matters. That matters enormously. Not just as a biographical fact, but as a cultural fact about what kind of representation his work offered and what it meant that his image became available for others to shape after his death. His Maori characters were not stereotypes. They were recognitions. They were drawn from inside a cultural experience with a depth of understanding that comes from living within that experience, not observing it from outside. When he performed those characters for mixed New Zealand audiences in the 1980s, he was doing something incredibly delicate. He was making the dominant culture laugh with a Maori experience, rather than at it. He was using the platform of mainstream comedy to insist on the full humanity of people that mainstream television frequently rendered invisible or simplistic. That is a precise and political act, even when it looks like entertainment. And when a television film comes along and simplifies the story of the man who did that, it risks also simplifying the cultural meaning of what he did. It risks flattening the political dimension of his work into individual tragedy. It risks making the story about one man's struggle with fame and illness rather than about what it meant in the New Zealand of the 1980s for a Maori comedian to become a national figure. Robert, whose journalism had engaged with these questions during Billy's lifetime, was careful and specific about this. He was not just a funny man. That was the reduction that was always being pushed onto him, the friendly, reductive version. Billy T, he's so funny, the funniest man in New Zealand. And he genuinely was, but the funniness was doing something. It was making an argument about representation, about visibility, about who gets to be the center of the story. The biopic didn't engage with that. It made his Maori identity part of the texture of his life, part of the story, but it didn't really understand what he was doing with it professionally. It understood. He was Maori, he sometimes faced prejudice, he used his identity in his work. That's the summary version. What it missed was the craft and the intention and the specific intelligence of what he was doing. Dave was more direct. He was changing what was possible, Dave said. For Maori performers, for Polynesian performers, for anyone in New Zealand who wasn't white and middle class and wanting to perform to white middle class audiences. He was showing that you could be fully yourself, your actual cultural self, and have the whole country love you for it. Not in spite of what you were, because of what you were. That's a big thing. That's a historically significant thing. And the film sort of acknowledged it and sort of didn't. It had the ingredients, but it didn't really cook them. Margaret offered a more personal observation. "I remember one rehearsal," she said. "He was working on a sketch, and he stopped in the middle and said something about how he wanted to make sure it felt real. Not like how people imagine Maori people talk, like how they actually talk." It was a small moment, but it told you everything about the level of attention he was paying, the care he was taking.
That care didn't make it onto the screen in the 2011 film. That precision, that insistence on authenticity.
And without it, you don't really understand why the work mattered. Tina held this thread carefully.
He was aware of what he was doing,
she said.
He thought about it. He talked about it.
When people tried to make him into just a funny man, just entertainment, he pushed back against that. Quietly, but he pushed back.
The film didn't capture that awareness. It made him feel like someone things happened to, rather than someone who was making deliberate choices.
And the deliberate choices were the whole point of him. Peter brought it back to the commercial reality. His image was worth money because he was loved, he said. And he was loved because of what he represented, because of what he meant to people. Not just as a funny man, but as something more than that. And when you monetize that image without understanding what created the value, you end up with something hollower than what you started with. The film wanted to access the love people had for Billy, but it didn't fully understand where that love came from, so it captured the surface of it and missed the depth. This is perhaps the most precise way to understand what went wrong with the 2011 film. Not malice, not incompetence, a genuinely insufficient understanding of the thing it was trying to honor. And that insufficient understanding produced a version that, while it moved audiences who didn't know him, felt profoundly wrong to the people who did. Always. Let's talk about what happened after the film aired. Not just immediately after, in the years that followed. Because the story of what the 2011 film did to Billy T. James's memory is not a single event. It's a slow process. And understanding that process requires looking at how memory and cultural identity work over time. In the immediate aftermath, there was pushback. Peter spoke to journalists. Tina made her feelings known. The 5 people who knew the real story found small platforms and used them. But the conversation had a ceiling. It could go only so far because of who it would hurt to go further. Billy's family was involved in complicated ways. His colleagues had complicated relationships with each other and with his memory. The New Zealand entertainment industry is small. Grievances, if aired too loudly, have consequences. And so the most pointed criticisms were expressed privately, or obliquely, or with enough qualification that they could not be directly challenged. This is not cowardice. This is the realistic calculation of people who have to continue living in the community where the film was made, who have relationships with people who worked on the film, who understand that burning bridges has costs. But it meant that the official record of the response to the film was thinner than the actual response. The loud disagreement that existed behind closed doors did not fully make it into the public record. Robert reflected on this years later. I knew what people were saying privately, he said. I was part of conversations that were quite frank about what the film had got wrong. But none of those conversations made it into print, not in a way that would stick. That's a journalistic failure in a way. We should have pushed harder. We should have found ways to put those conversations on record while people were still willing to have them. But there was also pressure not to. The film was seen, by many people in the industry, as a tribute, and criticizing a tribute to a beloved national figure is not an easy thing to do publicly. Dave thought about this differently. I don't know what the right thing to do was, he said. Say everything? Risk damaging relationships? Risk making it look like you're attacking people's sincere efforts to honor someone you all loved? Or hold back? Let the film be what it was, and live with the knowledge that the record isn't quite right. I chose to hold back. Mostly. And I've gone back and forth about whether that was right. What I can say is that the conversation about who Billy really was has continued, quietly, among people who knew him. And that matters, even if it's not on television. Margaret was practical about what holding back had cost. The film became the reference point, she said.
When young people, particularly young Maori performers, wanted to talk about Billy T. James, they started from the film. The film was what they knew.
And so conversations would begin from a slightly distorted baseline, and you'd find yourself constantly, gently correcting, not the big things, the texture, the small details that add up to the difference between a true picture and a false one.
It's exhausting work, and it never really ends.
Tina found her own way through it.
I talked to people I trusted, she said. I talked to family. I shared what I knew. I made sure that within my world, the real version was present.
I couldn't fight the television. You can't fight television. It's too big and too vivid, and it's already in people's heads.
But I could keep the real version alive in the spaces I had access to. And I did that. And I do that.
In the decade and a half since the film aired, the conversation about Billy T. James's legacy has shifted in ways that the 2011 film could not have anticipated. The conversation about representation in New Zealand media has changed. The conversation about how Maori performers and creators are treated by the mainstream industry has become more direct, more politically engaged, more historically informed. And in that changed context, the question of what the 2011 film did to Billy T. James's memory looks different than it did at the time. It looks like an example.
Not an isolated incident of a television film being somewhat inaccurate about someone, but an example of a pattern in which the mainstream industry profits from Maori creativity and talent, and then, when the opportunity arises, reshapes that creativity and talent to fit its own narrative needs. Robert put it plainly.
If we were making this argument now, in the context of conversations happening in New Zealand culture in 2024, it would be heard differently, he said. There would be a framework for understanding it. In 2011, the argument was, this film is not accurate, which is a smallish complaint. It sounds like nitpicking. Now the argument would be, this film is an example of an industry that extracted value from a Maori performer for 30 years, and then, once he was dead, extracted further value by reshaping his story for a new audience without adequate consultation with his whānau. That's a bigger argument, and it's the right argument. It just took a decade for the culture to be ready to hear it clearly. This is not hindsight being used to unfairly judge what people did in 2011. The people who were uncomfortable with the film in 2011 felt something real and articulated it as best they could. The culture simply didn't have, at that moment, the full vocabulary for what they were describing. Now it does. And the 5 people who knew the real Billy T. James are waiting, still, for the fuller conversation. Always. There is a specific question that runs through all of this, and it's worth naming directly. Who owns the story of a dead person? It sounds like a philosophical question, but it has very practical consequences. In law, the answer is relatively clear and relatively limited. The estate controls certain commercial rights. The family can pursue defamation claims if false statements of fact are made. But a dramatized film that makes interpretive rather than factual claims, that presents scenes as imaginative reconstructions rather than documented events, occupies territory that the law largely leaves alone. So the law doesn't really answer the question. Ethics tries. The ethical consensus in journalism and biography is something like, you should be as accurate as possible. You should give subjects and their families a meaningful chance to respond. You should be clear about what is established fact and what is interpretation. But the biopic is neither journalism nor straightforward biography. It operates in the space between document and fiction, and in that space, the ethical guidelines are far less developed. Peter had thought about this extensively. The question I kept coming back to was consent, he said. When Billy was alive, if a project wanted to use his image, his voice, his story in a significant way, they needed his consent. they needed to negotiate with me representing him. Once he died, that process disappeared. The family had some rights, but not the same kind of rights, not the practical, day-to-day power to shape what was done with his story. I understand why that's the case legally, but morally it feels wrong. The people who know someone best, who loved them most, who have the most legitimate stake in how they're remembered, they're the ones with the least formal power. And the people with the most formal power, the broadcasters, the production companies, they're the ones with the least intimate knowledge of who the person actually was. Robert offered a historical perspective. This is not a new problem. It's as old as biography. Shakespeare's plays about historical figures, films about Abraham Lincoln. The question of what you owe to the real person versus what you need to do to make the story work has been contested for centuries. What's different now is scale. A television film in 2011 reaches an audience of millions in a country of 4 million people, almost immediately. The corrective voice, if it exists, has to find a way to reach those same millions, which is essentially impossible. So the biopic wins, not because it's right, but because it's big. Dave brought it back to the personal. I think about what Billy would have said, he said, if he'd watched the film himself. And I think he would have had strong opinions. He was not someone who was passive about how he was represented. He pushed back against versions of himself that he didn't recognize. He did that publicly and privately throughout his career. He couldn't do it in 2011 because he was dead. And the film knew that. Not cynically, I don't think. But the absence of his voice was the precondition for the film being possible in the way it was. You couldn't have made that film while he was alive. He wouldn't have let it pass. Margaret came at the ownership question from the angle of the work. His comedy wasn't separate from him, she said. It wasn't a product he produced that then existed independently of him. It was an expression of who he was, what he understood, what he cared about. When you adapt his story for television without adequately consulting the people who knew him, you're not just being inaccurate about biographical details. You're misrepresenting what the work meant, where it came from, why it was what it was. That feels like a violation, not of a legal right, of something more fundamental. Tina was asked, in an interview some years after the film, whether she thought there could ever be a version of his story on film that she would feel good about. She thought for a moment. I don't know, she said. Maybe, if it were done differently. If the starting point were, what is true, and how do we serve the truth, rather than, what will make good television, and how do we use the facts we have to build toward that? If someone came to us, truly came to us, and said, help us understand who he was, not to validate our existing script, but to actually learn. That could work, maybe. But that would require the industry to care more about accuracy than about drama, and I'm not sure that's the world we live in. This honest uncertainty is, perhaps, the most truthful response available. Not, biopics should not be made about complex people. Not, television should never dramatize real lives. But, the people who carry the intimate truth of a person's life deserve to be genuine partners in how that life is dramatized, not consulted to fill in details, partners in shaping what the story is. And that is not, currently, how the biopic machine works. Always. Let's return to the film itself for a moment. Not to relitigate specific scenes or claim particular factual errors, but to look at the structural choices that shaped it. The film chose a frame. All biopics choose a frame. The frame is the fundamental interpretive lens through which all the events of a person's life are arranged and given meaning. For the 2011 Billy, the frame was, broadly, this was a man of great natural talent who struggled with the costs of fame, whose personal life was complicated by those struggles, and whose death was a tragedy that cut short a career still capable of greatness. That is not a false frame, but it is a partial one, and the partiality has consequences. When you frame a story as a tragedy of potential unrealized, everything in the story becomes evidence for that reading. The health problems become not just health problems, but symptoms of a deeper wound. The complicated relationships become evidence of someone unable to fully inhabit his private life because of what the public life demanded. Every difficulty gets read backward from the ending. But Billy T. James did not live his life from the ending. He lived it from wherever he was at any given moment. And from that perspective, the story looks quite different. Dave described what this alternative frame might have been. The frame I would have chosen, he said, is something more like, this was a man who achieved something remarkable, who changed what was possible for performers who looked like him and came from where he came from, who did the work with extraordinary skill and care, and whose life was complicated and full in the way that all real lives are complicated and full. That's not as clean a television story. It doesn't build to the same kind of cathartic ending. But it's closer to the truth. And it honors him differently, not as someone tragic, as someone accomplished, which is a different kind of honor. Robert observed that the choice of frame was not ideologically neutral. The tragic frame has a particular cultural valence, he said. When you tell the story of a Maori man as primarily a story of struggle and loss, you're drawing on and reinforcing a set of narratives that already exist in the culture. The noble but doomed figure, the talent destroyed by forces beyond his control. Those narratives have a history in how Maori stories get told in New Zealand. And I'm not saying the 2011 film was consciously invoking that history, but it was drawing on it. The frame it chose was the one that fit most readily. A frame that centered his achievement, his craft, his intentional choices, his agency, would have required more work, more comfort with complexity. It would also have been a more genuinely Maori frame. Because the stories Maori tell about Maori excellence don't usually center tragedy. They center achievement, continuity, the transmission of something valuable across generations. The 2011 film used the Pākehā frame and fitted Billy into it. Margaret thought about this in terms of what the film's audience was primed to feel. Audiences come to biopics with an existing relationship to the subject, she said. They know roughly how it ends. They know Billy T. James died young. They come in already feeling a certain kind of loss. The film, rather than complicating that feeling, confirmed it, deepened it, gave it a narrative form. That's effective television. It gives people what they came for, but more fully, more satisfyingly. But effective television and accurate portrait are different things. And when you optimize for the first, you often sacrifice the second. Peter returned to the fundamental commercial logic. The film was made because there was a market for it, he said. People wanted to see a film about Billy T. James. That demand is real, and it's legitimate. He was loved. The question is whether that legitimate demand justifies a product that the people closest to him didn't recognize. My answer is no, but I understand that's not the industry's answer. The industry's answer is, we made something that honored him. We made something that was watched by a lot of people. We told his story to a generation that didn't know it. That's valuable. And it's not nothing. It's not nothing at all. But it came at a cost, the cost of accuracy, the cost of the full, complicated, truly extraordinary human being being replaced, for a lot of people, by the television version. And that cost was borne by the people who loved him, not by the people who made the film. Tina put it most simply. I just wanted people to know the real him, she said. That's all. That's the whole thing. Not a version designed to make audiences cry in a certain way. Not a version shaped by what works best in a 90-minute format. The real him, which was harder and more interesting and more alive than any of that.
And I'm still trying to give people that. Still trying, all these years later. Because he deserves that. He deserves the real version to exist. Always. There is a specific dimension to this story that deserves its own attention. The question of silence. Not just the silence of the people who knew him and chose not to speak, but the silence that surrounds the entire subject. The 2011 film aired. People who were close to the story expressed discomfort, privately and in some cases publicly. And then, to a significant extent, things went quiet. Why? Part of the answer is the one already discussed, the small size of the New Zealand entertainment industry, and the social consequences of sustained public criticism. But part of the answer is something else. Something about how grief works, and how love for a public figure works, and how those two things interact with public discourse. When someone is loved, as Billy T. James was genuinely loved, criticism of anything done in their name feels like criticism of the love itself. If you say, "This film got him wrong," some people hear, "I don't think he was worth loving." Which is not what you're saying at all. You're saying the opposite. You're saying he was worth knowing accurately. But the emotional logic of grief doesn't always make room for that distinction. Peter noticed this effect early. When I expressed concerns about the film, I had people come back to me and say, "But it was a tribute. It was made with love." And I wanted to say, "So was the love of the people who actually knew him, and they're the ones saying it's wrong." But that argument doesn't land easily, because love and accuracy are treated as the same thing. A loving depiction is assumed to be an accurate one. And that's just not true. You can love someone deeply and still miss who they actually were. Dave had a related observation about the specific pressure on comedians. Comedians are particularly vulnerable to this, he said. Because comedy is the thing that's most visible about them. It's the thing people have the strongest relationship with. When you argue with the portrait of a comedian, you're implicitly arguing with the laughter they produced, with the joy, and people don't want to complicate their joy. They want to remember Billy as the man who made them laugh, full stop, uncomplicated, and anything that complicates that feels like a threat to the pure pleasure of the memory. But the pure pleasure of the memory is already a simplification. It's already an act of selection. Billy was complicated. The work was complicated. The joy it produced was real, but it came from somewhere specific, and knowing that place makes the joy richer, not poorer. That's what people lose when the biopic replaces the complicated reality with the simplified version. They lose the richness. They think they're getting more, getting the full story, but they're actually getting less. Margaret offered a specific example of what the richness looked like in practice. "There was a show in the early 1980s, she said. "I can't give you the exact details, but I remember the substance. He was rehearsing a piece, and there was something in it that felt slightly off to him. Not wrong, exactly, but not quite right. Most performers would have let it go. It was 90% there. It would have been funny. The audience would have laughed." But Billy kept working it, coming back to it, asking questions. What is this piece actually about? Not what does it look like it's about on the surface, but what is the thing underneath it that I'm actually trying to say? And when he finally figured out what the thing underneath it was, the piece changed. It became funnier, but also more true, both at the same time. That's what got lost in the biopic. That constant quest for the thing underneath the surface, that refusal to accept good enough when excellent was available. And without that, you don't understand why his best work was his best work. You just know that it was funny. Which is true, but hollow. Robert came back to the question of the record. "One of the things that matters most to me, professionally and personally, is that there be an accurate record," he said. "Not a perfect record, not a complete record. An accurate one."
And the 2011 film, for all its emotional power, made the record less accurate. It inserted scenes and characterizations that were dramatized inventions, and the people watching it largely took them as true. That bothers me. Not as personal criticism of the filmmakers, but as a fact about how the record stands. And I think there's a responsibility for people who care about accuracy and who have access to the fuller story to keep putting the fuller story into the record wherever possible. And that's what I try to do, in small ways, in conversations, in the occasional piece when the opportunity arises. It's inadequate, but inadequate is better than nothing. Tina had reached a particular equilibrium in the years since the film. "I've stopped being angry about it," she said. "Or mostly stopped. The anger doesn't help anything, and it's tiring to carry. What I've settled into is more like, I know the real story. The people who knew him know the real story, and we keep telling it to each other and to the people who will listen. And the television version exists too. And some people will only ever know that version. And that's a loss. But it's not the whole of it. The real version is still here. It's still alive. In the people who carry it. That's enough. It has to be enough. Always. So where does this leave us? What do the 5 people who knew the real Billy T. James have to say to us now, more than 30 years after his death, and more than a decade after the film that reopened the argument about his memory? Peter Rowley, who managed him, spent years in the industry that used Billy's image. He has watched the machine from the inside for a long time. "I'm not naive about the industry," he said. "I understand how it works. I've worked in it. I've made choices within it that I don't feel entirely clean about. What I've come to believe is that the responsibility sits at multiple levels, with the people making individual decisions, but also with the structure that makes those decisions inevitable. The biopic machine produces what it produces because the incentives are set up the way they are. Accuracy is not rewarded. Drama is rewarded. Ratings are rewarded. Until the incentive structure changes, the problem doesn't go away. And the incentive structure changes when audiences change, when people start demanding more than what the machine produces, when the demand for accuracy and complexity is loud enough to shape what gets made. I don't know if that will happen, but it's the only thing that would actually fix the problem. Dave, the comedian who came up through the same circuit, has continued to perform and to work in the industry. "I think about what we owe to the people who came before us," he said, "the ones who made things possible that weren't possible before. Billy was one of those people. He made things possible. And what we owe them is the real story, not the simplified story, the one that shows why what they did was hard and specific and took courage and craft. Because the young performers coming up now, the Maori performers, the Polynesian performers, the ones from backgrounds that weren't represented on New Zealand television until people like Billy made it happen, they deserve to know the full story of how the door got opened. Not just that someone opened it, but how, what it cost, what it required, what the person who did it was actually like. That knowledge is useful. That knowledge is armor." Margaret, who had been present for the making of his television work, returned to the question of craft. "The message I'd want people to take from all of this," she said, "is take the work seriously. His work was serious, not solemn, serious. He cared about it deeply, and he worked hard at it. When we reduce performers to their image, their public face, their catchphrases, we erase the work. And the work is what was meaningful. The work is what changed things." The 2011 film didn't adequately show the work, and I think if it had started from a genuine respect for the craft rather than from a desire to tell a touching story, the film would have been better, both more accurate and more interesting. The craft is the interesting thing. The craft is where the real story lives. Robert, who had spent his career as a journalist asking hard questions about real people, was measured. "I think the 2011 film was a product of its time and its form," he said. "It made the choices that films like it make. Some of those choices were wrong, and some of them were thoughtful, and some of them were both simultaneously." What I'd want people to understand is that the choice to make a biopic is not a neutral choice. It's an exercise of power. You are claiming the authority to define how someone will be remembered. That authority should come with obligations. The obligation to consult meaningfully with the people who knew the subject. The obligation to be honest about what is documented and what is invented. The obligation to ask, am I serving the truth here, or am I serving my narrative? Those obligations aren't currently enforced by law. They're a matter of ethics, and they're not sufficiently honored. That's the change I'd want to see. Not no biopics, better biopics. Ones that treat their subjects as fully human and their families as genuine partners. Tina, Billy's daughter, was asked what she most wanted people to understand about her father. She thought for a long time. "I want people to understand that he was funny because he was paying attention," she said. "Not because he was trying to be funny, because he was watching the world carefully, listening to it, taking it seriously." And that attention, that watching and listening and taking seriously, that's what produced the comedy. It wasn't the other way around. He wasn't a comedy machine who happened to also have a life. He was a person who paid attention, and the comedy was what that attention produced. That's what I want people to know. That's the thing I'm most afraid will get lost. The attention, the seriousness underneath the laughter, the care. That's who he was. And that is perhaps the most honest epitaph available for a man whose life was large enough to contain multitudes, complicated enough to resist simplification, and meaningful enough that the argument about how to remember him is still alive more than 30 years after he left. The biopic told one story, and it told it to millions. But the real story is still here, in the people who carry it, in the conversations they have, in the small corrections and the larger testimonies, and the refusal to let the simplified version be the only version. The fight over Billy T. James's memory is not over. It may never be over. And that, finally, is a tribute to how much he mattered. For Billy T. James, for the 5 people who watched the machine try to simplify him and refused to entirely let it. For every performer whose story will eventually become someone else's television drama. And for the question that never fully resolves itself. Who gets to say who you were? Always. There is one more dimension of this story worth dwelling on before we close. It concerns the specific experience of watching someone you love become public property. Peter, Dave, Margaret, Robert, Tina. 5 people with 5 different relationships to Billy T. James, 5 different kinds of access to who he really was. But they share something, an experience that is hard to describe to people who haven't had it. The experience of watching the world's version of someone you knew compete with your own version. Of navigating the gap between the public image and the private knowledge. Of having to decide again and again how much to say and when and to whom. Peter described it as living in 2 registers simultaneously. There's the public Billy, he said, the one that everyone talks about, the catchphrases, the television appearances, the clips on YouTube. And there's the Billy I knew, who was funny but also difficult, who was generous but also demanding, who was braver about some things than people realize, and more frightened about other things than people would guess. I live with both versions. The public one comes at me from the outside, from conversations and anniversaries and tributes. The private one I carry inside.
And they don't always fit together neatly, which is fine. Real people don't fit together neatly. But the friction is real.
And the 2011 film made that friction worse, because it created a third version. Not the public one I'd always known about, not my private one. A television one, with an actor's face.
And now there are 3 of him in the world, and I'm the only one who knows which one is closest to the truth.
Dave had been thinking about this for years in terms of what it means for the living. When someone who is real to you becomes a cultural figure, he said, there's a particular kind of loneliness in it. Everyone around you thinks they know the person. They've seen the footage, they've heard the stories, they have an opinion. And your opinion, the one formed from actual encounter, from sharing stages, from being in the same room, doesn't have any special status in the world's eyes. You're just one voice among many. The fan who watched every television appearance might feel just as qualified to say who Billy was as I do, even though they never met him. That's not their fault. That's just how celebrity culture works. But it's strange. It produces this weird equality of ignorance and knowledge, where having actually known someone gives you no formal advantage in the conversation about who they were. Margaret thought about the specific loneliness of being a production assistant.
I was backstage, she said. That's where I was. Not in front of the cameras, not in the audience. Backstage, making the thing work.
The people who knew Billy from backstage know a completely different person from the one the audience knew. The audience knew the performance. We knew what came before the performance and what happened after.
We knew the preparation and the exhaustion, and the moments when it wasn't going well, and the adjustments and the recovery. We knew the craft.
And that backstage knowledge is the knowledge that biopics most consistently fail to capture. Because it's not visual, it's not dramatic, it doesn't look good on screen.
You can't film a man sitting with a notebook, working through the problem of a piece that isn't right yet, and make it as compelling as film him performing to an adoring crowd.
But the notebook is more true. The notebook is where the real person lives. Robert, as a journalist, came at it from the question of the archive. Everything I know about Billy that came from direct encounter is in my notebooks, he said. The quotes, the observations, the things that didn't make it into print because they were too small or too specific or too difficult to fit into a profile.
And none of that is in the archive in any usable way. It's not indexed, it's not searchable, it's not going to be found by someone doing research for a documentary.
What is in the archive is the public record, the television appearances, the reviews, the formal interviews.
And the public record is accurate as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't reach the parts that were most alive.
That's a failure of documentation culture. We document the performance. We don't document the performer.
And when the performer is gone, the gap in the documentation becomes permanent.
Tina had found a way over the years to hold her version of her father alongside all the public versions. I used to get angry when people talked about him in ways that felt wrong, she said.
That specific frustration of, you think you know him, but you don't.
I've moved past that, mostly.
Now I think of it as, they know their version of him, and he gave them that version. That's a gift he gave. The comedy, the image, the presence, those were real things. The fact that they're not the whole of him doesn't make them false.
And I carry the other part, the fuller part, the part he gave to people who were close.
Together, maybe, the different versions add up to something like the full person. No one person has the whole picture, but put us all in a room and talk for long enough, and maybe he emerges.
That's how I think about it now. Not as competing versions, as partial pictures that could, if you held them all at once, make something closer to the truth. The 2011 film is one of those pictures, an imperfect one, a distorted one in places. But it's not nothing. It's part of the conversation. The problem is only when it tries to be the whole conversation.
And it shouldn't be. No single thing should be. This is, perhaps, the most generous way of looking at what the 2011 film did and did not achieve. Not as an erasure of the real Billy T. James, but as one partial and imperfect contribution to an ongoing conversation about who he was. A conversation that the people who knew him are still in, still shaping, still pushing back against versions that miss the mark. A conversation that will continue, probably, for as long as his work continues to matter. Which is to say, a very long time. Because the work is still there. The catchphrases, the characters, the specific combination of warmth and precision and political intelligence that made him unlike anyone else. The work is still there, and in the work, alive and present, and more vivid than any television drama, is the real Billy T. James, waiting to be seen clearly, by everyone who is willing to look. For Peter, Dave, Margaret, Robert, and Tina. For the conversations still happening, still correcting, still insisting on the fuller version. For Billy T. James, who made people laugh in ways that required them, without knowing it, to also see more clearly. And for the question that is really the heart of this whole story. When the work is still alive, can the person ever truly be lost? The answer, we hope, is no. Always.